Hi, I am Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. We're going to follow up on something we've been talking about for a while, and that is lack of leadership, but never-ending money printing. Stacy.
Well, the thing about the Triffin dilemma, as we have covered, is that this was predicted since Bretton Woods, is that there's always a clash between domestic and international policy for the reserve currency because you have to print money and you have to send it overseas. So first you get rid of your gold, then you get rid of your manufacturing. So we got rid of that. When we got rid of our manufacturing here in the United States in order to support the US dollar as reserve currency, one of the problems is that we no longer really had any sort of domestic policy other than money printing. So the failure of this is being really seen during these global ongoing lockdowns over a year and a half into this global pandemic. And so I was asking myself, what would have happened to us had China not shut down last year? We got all these thousands of dollars in stimulus checks, and most people bought durable goods, washing machines, refrigerators, and stuff like that from China. Well, we're seeing the clash now between money printing and supply chains. So supply chains hashtag, this is from Chicago Girl, and she's retweeting this story about world's second largest container port, Ningbo Zhoushan in China, has shut down due to one COVID case of a fully vaccinated port worker. Serious disruptions to global trade and supply chains are feared.
This is a problem because of the fragility of global trade. Now, we did talk about the idea of deglobalization and de-dollarization back in January, and we're seeing the ravages of such an outcome play out in the post-COVID world. And I guess the question is, what would have happened if China, had taken a different course of action? I guess the question is, what happens now that China's vulnerable to shutting down? That's the question, right?
Yeah, because the Delta variant is way more infectious. It spreads faster. So it looks like they're going to try to contain it the same way they did last year. Last year, they were very successful at it and kept on being able to manufacture and ship everything here. But we're already seeing really high inflation numbers here with the supply chains that were fragile over the past year. But now if they're even going to get more fragile, and of course, the White House has mentioned it. So White House economic advisor Dees says White House trying to address supply chain issues to help curb inflation in an MSNBC interview. What can they do, right? China, if they get COVID, they're going to have to shut down, right? So somebody's going to have to do this production. We already, in order to maintain the dollar as U.S. reserve currency, we had to, of course, send our manufacturing overseas long ago. So the whole rebuilding supply chains here, which we said last year, 14, 15 months ago, everybody in the news was like, we need to have some supply chain here. We need to restore some manufacturing. That never happened in the whole year and a half we had to start planning things. Instead, we just kept throwing money because that's the one single way they have to address everything.
Well, I'll give you a very stark reality check here. So the Washington just is in the process of passing a multi-trillion-dollar stimulus check. Infrastructure bill, which is aimed toward what should be, you would think, at this exact issue. But for some reason, it's get held up because of the one or two paragraphs that relate to, quote, cryptocurrencies. Because why? Because Bitcoin is a threat to the U.S. dollar, and the U.S. dollar is the basis of the U.S. empire and all the debt associated with the U.S. dollar. And it trumps anything to do with manufacturing, right? It's all about keeping the Ponzi scheme going. Bitcoin threatens the Ponzi scheme. If, in fact, the Biden administration wanted to solve this infrastructure problem as it relates to global supply chains and infrastructure, the bill would have been timely and well received as a way to answer the problem that the U.S. has no domestic manufacturing and is entirely reliant on China. But instead, they appeased the bankers. They said, let's hold up the infrastructure bill for a couple of paragraphs because we are scared of Bitcoin and it might threaten Wall Street, and Wall Street gives us all the money we need to continue our re-election campaign. So it's really starkly laid out for anyone who cares to see it.
Right. Well, they passed that $1.1 trillion infrastructure bill, and they're now introducing a $3.5 trillion budget. So we're going to go over this. But again, like the fact that the elite have no answers for the deplorables other than money printing. It's the equivalent of let them eat cake. They're just throwing a fiat fluff at them, that like a donut, a brioche, that doesn't actually have any nutritional value any longer because there's nothing backing that dollar any longer. And what, like even that whole cryptocurrency thing that was introduced into the infrastructure bill, what it was really about was being able to restore the deduction for the wealthy people of California and places like New York, where they have a high property taxes to sustain all those like infrastructure there, all the welfare benefits, all that sort of like, democratic policy in those states. But they get to write those huge, if you're paying $100,000 in property tax on your Manhattan apartment that costs like $30-40 million, then you get to write it off against your federal taxes. But Trump ended that SALT deduction, and so they capped it at just $10,000 that you're allowed to write off. So one of the reasons why they want to introduce this they want to take $30 billion from cryptocurrency sector in order to cover the $50 billion that it's going to cost to give the tax break to these wealthy Democratic voters for the most part. So we're going to go into this. We're going to look at this headline about the more money printing in light of all of these, the supply problems happening. Hours after the U.S. Senate approved a $3.5 trillion budget blueprint aimed to ease the financial strain on American families, new fissures emerged between the moderate and liberal wings of the Democratic Party over the size and scope of the spending. Now, quickly, I asked in our tweet response to this Reuters piece, define this financial strain, because household incomes are at all-time highs and consumers are on an unprecedented spending spree. Stock markets and property prices are all-time highs as well. So why are we blowing our wad during boom times? Is this just for midterms or Ponzi economics?
Yeah, you make a good point there. They keep passing these emergency bills for the crisis. But what crisis? The stock market all-time high, property markets all-time high, bond markets at all-time high. What crisis are they talking about? The crisis is that you've got a few folks that are missing payments on their 280-foot yachts. That's the crisis. And they need more free money from the Fed.
I also think it's like that Chernobyl moment where, the scientists there are like, yeah, everything's fine. It's all fine. Like there's a meltdown behind them. And like we're containing it. The same thing here is like, they know, the policymakers know. I mean, these guys aren't stupid, right? They're economists and they've been trained and they know that their academic papers are wrong and they see the data and they know that all they could do is print. And so they're trying to convince people that more money printing, the money printing will continue until morale improves. Like they know you can't taper a Ponzi, right? They know that this is the end game of that. But the problem is for us, I think, is not only the supply chain issues that are happening and the inflation that is starting to set in around the world and the inflation mindset, but the stories coming out of China makes you very concerned about what happens next. Because if there's a disintegrating empire because of a Thucydides trap of a rising empire, a rising power, and China seems to be doing their whole treasure fleet situation again. So just so you know, for what happened with the treasure fleet of China, is that 500 years ago, China destroyed its world-dominating navy because its political elite was afraid of free trade. In the 1400s, China owned the greatest seagoing fleet in the world, up to 3,500 ships at its peak. The U.S. Navy today has only 430. Some of them were 5 times the size of the ships being built in Europe at the time. But by 1525, all of China's treasure fleet had been destroyed because the political elite were afraid of the actual entrepreneurial business elite. So they destroyed that. And that seems to be going on there again. And of course, China did sink then for the next few hundred years.
Well, that's a key point there. The China became the hermit kingdom, right?
Yes.
They were like, just disappeared off the map after they did that for many hundreds of years. And so they have a propensity to commit financial suicide.
Well,
and are they doing that again today? Because the elites fear the rise of the mercantile class. Jack Ma, for example, he's been shut down because the elites don't like that kind of competition. Are they going to do another burning of the fleet?
Yeah, that's a good question because, everybody's kind of counting on there's being some big economic force out there to keep the global trade, global economy alive. So if you're going to burn your treasure fleet of those social media huge companies, like the successful companies like TikTok or Ant Financial in the financial sector, or now they're taking down private school owners or forced to hand over institutions to the Chinese state. So there's like a lot of really successful companies. It's hard to know what's actually coming out of China because there's so much FUD in the Western press covering it. But, we need to get Dan Collins on to talk about this again, because it does seem like they're burning down their treasure fleet again. Remember, right after they burned down their treasure fleet right when Florence then became the Renaissance, the age of discovery, all the vastness and greatness that then the next 2 centuries were European, right? So they handed it over to them, even though, their ships, for example, were 5 times larger than what Christopher Columbus had used to sail to
Right, before
America.
the English or British Empire ruled the seas and the sun never set on the British Empire. That was true in China 500 years ago. They had effectively conquered the globe through a massive global fleet of ships. They burnt it to the ground because the elites were paranoid that they were losing celebrity status to the captains of these ships. So,
Yeah. They were the eunuch generals. In fact, the eunuch general who was the king of the treasure fleets, his name was Admiral Zheng He, and he was actually wiped from the history books. Nobody knew about him for a few hundred years because they erased his name from the history books.
Wow, that's like a double eunuch.
But so just to put this into context of what Keiser Report covers in terms of the fourth turning of the Thucydides trap, of these cycles that do happen, but then something like this, a treasure fleet moment where you burn down your source of wealth. The U.S. did the same thing. When we went off the gold standard, essentially, that was a treasure fleet moment. We were, the surviving power after World War II. And now China's in the same place post-COVID.
Wow. Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, much more coming your way. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to return to our conversation with Alasdair Macleod of goldmoney.com. Alasdair, welcome back.
Nice to be back, Max.
Now, we're picking up where we left off. We're talking about a pretty seismic event in the gold world, anyway. This is the new Basel III guidance pertaining to leverage in the system and derivatives. The stable funding ratio will be adjusted. And so this has implications for all markets, all banks. And of course, gold is still base money. It's still tier 1 money. It's still the basis of the global banking system, even though we don't have an official gold standard as such. It's still the currency, the money that's used inter-central bank. It still does settle all global business at the end of the day. So just to get into some of the finer points here, what's the difference between forwards and futures?
Forwards basically are bilateral agreements between 2 parties dealing in not in sort of unstandardized contracts, whereas futures are standardized contracts on a regulated exchange. And I think the important point to understand is that funds and investors and investment management businesses who are regulated will deal almost entirely on a regulated exchange. Anything they do on the over-the-counter market is very, very limited if they can do it at all. So they're 2 completely different markets, and the participants in the OTC market are basically ultra-high net worth individuals, sovereign wealth funds, central banks, other banks, and so on and so forth. So one is regulated, the other isn't. One is standardized, and the other isn't.
So forwards is just another word for over-the-counter market. These are deals that are negotiated between 2 parties, and they're not on the formal exchange. And so this has been. Let's look at this 50th anniversary of the Nixon Shock, which happened on a Sunday night, August 15th, 1971, the end of Bretton Woods, effectively. Recently, the IMF called for a new Bretton Woods. All righty. What's your expectation there?
When you look at what the central banks are trying to do, you can see they've clearly lost their way. They've got themselves into a bit of a cul-de-sac, and they're wondering how to get out of it. What we have had is, from the end of the Bretton Woods, and particularly from the 1980s onwards, we have had banks moving from doing what they should be doing, which is lending money to businesses to expand their production and all the rest of it. They've stopped doing that, or they've stopped expanding in that direction. They've expanded into purely financial transactions. Now, that ended up with a blow up, if you like, with the Lehman crisis, very, very obviously. There was a huge risk of complete contagion throughout the world from that blow up. And the authorities, if you like, in the form of G20, instructing the Bank of International Settlement, said, we can't have this risk. Please deal with it. So the Basel III regulations are the result of that. Now, it seems to me that what Basel III is actually doing is it is limiting the further expansion of banks into these financial activities. It's effectively calling a halt to that expansion. So we've gone from the situation in 1971, going off Bretton Woods, then we had the inflation in the 70s, and then we had all that sort of financial stuff. That is now being called to a halt. So where do banks go? I think that what the central banks are now doing is they're looking at a reset, if you like, which will probably involve central bank digital currencies. Now, this is something that they would be planning to do over a period of time, because no central bank can introduce a digital currency without massive back testing and all the rest of it. So that is not something that will happen very quickly. But do note that the Bank of International Settlements is coordinating all the research on central bank digital currencies for the whole central banking system. So you can see that the two things appear to be tied together. And I think that what is evolving is a potential escape route from commercial banking, providing the expansion of bank credit for business in the general sense, to central banks getting more involved in it. So we could find that if everything goes to plan, which of course is another issue, that over the next 5 to 10 years, this sort of evolution out of current commercial banking as being central, if you like, to the fiat monetary system, that is probably going to come. We're going to see that that's coming to an end, as it were. And I think that roughly is the sort of game plan that some of the major central banks have.
So in other words, they've been making all this credit available to banks, but banks have not been lending, right? Money velocity has collapsed. So are the central banks, are the Bank of International Settlement, the BIS simply saying that, calling time on these banks and saying, we're actually going to just come up with our own central bank digital currency, cut you out of the equation. We're just going to deal directly with the public, as it were, and throw the banks under the bus because they decided to keep all the money. They won't lend it out.
Yes, I mean, it appears that is the set, if you like, the drift, if you like, of where policy is going. And so it's sort of, I think it makes one feel that we're almost at a position of peak banking. I mean, what happens from there actually is not a simple matter, because banks being bypassed by central banks lending digital currency direct to borrowers, direct to consumers to go and consume it, and all the rest of it, and managing where that consumption is. I mean, this raises so many questions, and this is going to be something that I think is going to take some time to implement.
Right. Now, Stacy has a theory that it'll be like a Sunday night massacre, like the Nixon Sunday night shock. It'll all be dumped on the world, in a surprise, one Sunday night. These policymakers, they're not known for their nuance, are they? They tend to be kind of ham-fisted about things. But if in fact they implement such a thing, and by the way, I believe Simon Dixon, like Bank to the Future, was the first to kind of forecast this, and he started talking about this maybe even 3 years ago. That means that we have a new kind of world in which central bank digital currencies are the norm. And we also know that they're talking about these new central bank digital currencies coming with an expiration date, that you have to spend it within 18 months or it expires worthless, like an airline frequent flyer mile. Are you hearing similar things?
Yes, indeed. And if you read all the stuff on the Bank of International Settlements website about the research and all the rest of it that the central banks have done, that is one of the options which central banks are very, very keen on. That is for sure.
Also, the IMF, of course, has its own currency. It's called the special drawing right, and they've increased the supply by triple. It's over near 600 billion now, and it seems like there's something in motion there. One of the theories put forward over the years has been that the central banks give themselves a bailout by swapping all of the junk that they swapped with Wall Street for a new SDR. So now SDRs become the reserve of the central bank system, which is problematic because it means for democratic countries like the United States, you have one more layer of government and probably end up paying taxes to local, state, federal, and then global.
I think that the problem for the United States is even greater than that. The United States loves her hegemony through the dollar, and I don't think the United States is going to want to give that one up easily. These are all issues which I think mean the whole thing is actually up in the air, and we don't quite know how this is going to settle down. And of course, the other thing is that the largest manufacturing nation in the world is now China, and what they will take for payment and what they will pay out for their commodities and all the rest of it is likely to have a pretty large say in how this evolves. And they've done their own research in terms of their own central bank digital currency and have been so advanced with it that they've actually done some testing on it. So, I think there's so many questions being raised by this, more questions than answered by a long, long way.
Let me ask you this, because you're kind of my go-to guy on geopolitics, finance, history. So I've been saying this recently. I want to get your take on it and help me if I'm not seeing this correctly. But it seems that after a couple of decades of China fixing their exchange rate and building this huge economy through exports subsidized by the U.S. taxpayer, the U.S. worker, et cetera, that they now feel pretty confident that they can, if they have to, open the trap door under the dollar and destroy that symbiotic relationship that's existed between the consumer in America and the producer in China. They've been buying gold like crazy. They seem to be stretching their legs geopolitically and looking at territory, actual territory, to expand. Is China getting ready to pull the plug on the dollar, or what do you think?
I don't think so, for the simple reason that I don't think China wants to be blamed for the dollar's collapse. What we don't know is to what extent she's already hedged her dollar position. She's got, roughly $3 trillion amongst, bank deposits and U.S. treasuries and all the rest of it. So actually, for her to trigger a collapse in the dollar is very much a financial nuclear action, and I just don't see her doing that. What she has done, I think, also is she's used her dollars, her cash dollars, very much to lend to her suppliers. I mean, like the African countries and so on, so she has got those long-term assets, if you like, coming back to her in dollars. I'm sure in some cases that she's probably tied it to the renminbi rate. That wouldn't surprise me at all. But I just don't see that it is in her interest to collapse the dollar. I think what she's doing instead is she has taken the cue from the way things have developed to try and build her presence in Asia. And she's doing this particularly through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And things have been coming her way. I mean, Iran, for example, that is an interesting situation. And not only that, but Afghanistan, America has now pulled out. That is now coming together as far as China is concerned. She's already talking to the Taliban. And the idea there basically is that at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization level, the Taliban will probably be central in ensuring that Muslim terrorism doesn't spread from Afghanistan into neighboring stans. So you can see that the whole of this Mackinder paradigm is all coming together for China and Russia under the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And in terms of her own economy, she's also trying very, very hard, I think, to ensure that it doesn't overheat. And so she has been, while we have been trying to stimulate our economies, she's been actually slowing down. Meanwhile, of course, massive, massive trade deficits in America and also the UK, basically as a result of government budget deficits, means that China still has massive exporting business to the West.
Right. Got to cut it off there, Alasdair. Thanks so much for being on Keiser Report.
My pleasure, Max.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank our guest, Alasdair Macleod of goldmoney.com. Until next time, bye, y'all.